Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a dramatic, paradigm-shifting history that literally transformed how we study human origins. We're going to trace the evolution of a scientific discipline that actually had to unlearn its own founding assumptions just to truly understand what it means to be human. It's an absolutely fascinating journey of scientific self-correction, so let's get right into it. So, between 2018 and 2021, the American Association of Physical Anthropologists did something kind of surprising. They held a series of votes to replace the word physical in their name with biological, becoming the AABA. Now, you might be wondering, why would a massive, international, century-old scientific society go through the whole shebang of changing its core identity? I mean, what was actually wrong with the word physical? Well, to answer that, we really have to look at the core difference between these two paradigms. We're talking about moving away from an outdated, static way of classifying human bodies into fixed types, kind of like the way you might have been taught in old textbooks, and moving toward a highly dynamic understanding of evolutionary processes. See, physical anthropology was historically anchored in descriptive measurements. Biological anthropology, on the other hand, is completely process-oriented, grounded in population genetics and evolutionary theory.
Here's our roadmap for this explainer. We'll track the discipline's transformation through four critical eras. First, the roots of racial science. Second, Washburn's new physical anthropology. Third, the paleogenomic revolution. And finally, its reckoning and ethical rebirth.
All right, starting with Section 1, the roots of racial science, spanning from the Enlightenment to the 19th century. Back during the 18th and 19th centuries, naturalists were heavily influenced by colonialism and basically sought to classify human beings just like they did animals and plants. And during this time, a highly influential pseudoscientific theory called polygenism really took hold. Polygenism claimed that different human races were entirely separate biological species with unequal, unalterable capacities. Early American physical anthropologists like physician Samuel George Morton used craniometry, which is the literal measuring of skulls, to try and prove this. It sounds almost absurd to us today, but they actually thought filling skulls with mustard seed and lead shot could somehow measure intelligence and prove distinct species. Tragically, these early collections and theories were actively used to provide pseudoscientific justifications for institutions like slavery and indigenous displacement. Take a look at these comparative sketches. They're from an 1854 text called Types of Mankind by Josiah Knott and George Glidden. Polygynists erroneously used drawings exactly like these to argue that physical traits were completely fixed. They even tried linking black facial traits to primates to establish a rigid racial hierarchy. It was essentially a worldview that assumed nature was just a stable, set order without any evolutionary change whatsoever. So, this early era really bogged the discipline down in what's known as a religion of taxonomy. They were entirely focused on measuring skulls to rank intelligence, classifying people by distinct geography and skin color, assuming physical traits were totally immutable, and they completely ignored how human bodies actually adapt to environmental changes. It was just a deeply flawed system of rigid biological determinism. Moving right along to Section 2, Washburn's new physical anthropology, or as we like to call it, the rebellion. As we move into the 20th century, a real scientific rebellion kicked off. Figures like Franz Boas started proving that biological traits, like skull shape, were actually plastic and responsive to the environment. But the really decisive turning point came from a man named Sherwood Washburn. In 1951, Washburn published a landmark manifesto demanding a move away from measurement and classification and toward the processes and mechanisms of evolutionary change. Washburn argued that human variation was continuous, and it just simply could not be broken up into discontinuous, static races. He effectively integrated the field with Darwinian natural selection and genetics. This initiated an absolutely massive paradigm shift for the development of biological anthropology. If you look at this comparison, the discipline moved away from a focus on static anthropometric traits over to population genetics. The ultimate outcome shifted from racial classification to genuinely understanding adaptation. And instead of just sitting in a lab measuring skeletons, Washburn pushed researchers out into the field to study living primates right in their natural habitats. And that last point is huge. Washburn championed behavioral primatology. He personally led some groundbreaking research on baboon troops down in Kenya, basically arguing that you had to look at locomotion, social structure, and ecology as one cohesive evolutionary complex. His vision directly inspired famous field researchers like Jane Goodall, Dian Fossey, and Barutzi Galdicus to study chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans in the wild. Which brings us to Section 3, the paleogenomic revolution, molecules and ancient DNA. As we enter the late 20th century, genetics completely shattered any remaining typological thinking with cold, hard molecular data. Back in 1967, scientists used immunological blood tests as a sort of molecular clock to measure exactly how long ago humans and apes diverged. Then, by the 1980s, mitochondrial DNA was successfully tracing our maternal origins all the way back to Africa. And then, starting in the late 90s, geneticists pulled off a feat straight out of a science fiction movie, actually extracting and decoding DNA preserved inside ancient hominin fossils. And this led to some truly mind-blowing discoveries. Thanks to ancient DNA sequencing, pioneered by scientists like Nobel laureate Svante Pääbo, we now know that if you are of non-African descent, approximately 2% of your DNA comes directly from Neanderthals. No way, right? But the DNA proved undeniably that different human species, both archaic and modern, actually met and interbred during the Paleolithic era. Because of this new genetic evidence, scientists basically had to throw out and update their visual metaphors for human evolution. We used to think of a simple family tree, or maybe a trellis model with straight vertical lines and crisscrossing gene flow. But today, anthropologists use what's called the braided stream model. Picture different human populations emerging, floating away, petering out, and then connecting back together to varying degrees over hundreds of thousands of years. It's this web-like interconnected flow, meaning pure human races literally never existed.
Now, for our final part, Section 4, Reckoning and Ethical Rebirth, the Biocultural Paradigm.
Understanding our genetic connectedness is really only half the story here. The discipline also had to turn a critical eye on its own past, specifically grappling with the marginalized bodies sitting in its historic anatomical collections. A massive catalyst for this was the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA, which passed in 1990. This law forced a very necessary ethical shift, giving Native American tribes the legal pathway to repatriate their ancestors' remains from museums and universities. It essentially forced the discipline to confront the fact that a lot of its foundational collections were created through the non-consensual use of marginalized bodies. Because of that, today the field is adopting what's known as the ethical client framework. These steps completely reverse the old power dynamic. Researchers now consult with descendant communities as the primary client. Together, they collaboratively approve research designs, and ultimately, remains are repatriated according to the community's traditional wishes. It's a real game changer because it transforms human remains from objects of extraction into subjects of a respectful partnership.
And this whole journey brings us to the modern biocultural approach. Today's biological anthropologists explore how culture and environment directly impact our biology. A classic example of this is studying the genetic relationship between sickle cell anemia and cultural farming practices that actually increased mosquito habitats. It's an integrative science now, one that rejects pseudoscientific racial constructs and actively seeks to restore identity to historically silenced voices. But as Professor Karlina Delakova points out, changing the name from physical to biological is pretty meaningless if it's just a label. The discipline has to continuously demonstrate that it's willing to wrestle with its past and prove it is truly inclusive. Ethical action absolutely must accompany these scientific advancements. Which leaves us with a final provocative thought. How will our understanding of a braided stream of human origins, combined with deep ethical accountability, shape the next era of discovery? If there's one thing the development of biological anthropology shows us, it's that science isn't just a collection of static facts. It's a living, breathing process of self-correction. By unlearning its past, this discipline has finally learned how to truly study humanity. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the world around you.